Before the world understood what was coming, there remained a quiet, persistent belief that humanity had already seen its worst. The scars of the First World War were still visible, etched into broken cities and silent stretches of land where battles had once raged. People spoke of the war to end all wars with a kind of cautious hope, as if repetition might make it real. Yet beneath that fragile sense of peace, something darker was taking shape slowly and with intent. How does a society convince itself that catastrophe cannot return, even as the conditions for it begin to form? And what happens when violence is no longer an accident of history but something organized and sustained? For many, the 1930s did not feel like the edge of a crisis. It felt instead like a period of uneasy recovery. Across Europe, nations worked to rebuild not just their economies but their sense of identity, after years of loss and humiliation. In Germany, that recovery took on a more dangerous direction. A wounded national pride began to turn inward, searching for causes, for explanations, and ultimately for someone to blame. In towns and cities, daily life continued with familiar rhythms. Markets opened early. Children walked to school. Radios carried music news and the voices of leaders. Factories operated where they could, though work was not always steady. The Great Depression had reshaped daily existence across continents, turning stability into uncertainty and forcing millions to focus simply on getting by. In Japan, expansion was increasingly viewed as a solution to economic and resource pressures. The nation's leadership saw limited options at home and looked outward toward territories that might provide what they lacked. In the Soviet Union, industrial growth moved forward at a relentless pace. It transformed the country, but not without cost. Entire communities were uprooted, reshaped to fit a vision of rapid modernization that allowed little room for resistance. Across the world there was a sense of movement, economic strain, political tension, rising nationalism. Pressures built gradually, often out of sight. But for most people the world still seemed stable. Until it changed. The shift did not come all at once. It unfolded through a series of choices, each one defended, each one explained, each one bringing the world closer to conflict. In 1939, the invasion of Poland marked a turning point. German forces moved quickly, using coordinated attacks that combined armor, air power, and speed. This approach, later known as Blitzkrieg, transformed how war was fought. It was no longer a slow, drawn-out struggle. It was fast, precise, and overwhelming. Within weeks, Poland had fallen. Britain and France declared war, but their response could not match the pace of this new kind of conflict. Europe was drawn into a war that was not only about territory but about competing visions of the world. What set this moment apart was not simply the return of war, but the way it was being carried out and the ideas driving it. The forces behind the conflict were deeply connected. Technology, industry, and political ideology combined to reshape entire nations into systems built for war. Factories shifted their purpose. Assembly lines that once produced civilian goods were redirected toward military needs. Aircraft, tanks, and weapons were manufactured on a scale that reflected the demands of total war. Scientific advances accelerated this process, introducing new capabilities that expanded both reach and impact. At the same time, information became a tool. Governments used media to shape public perception, to build support, and to maintain control. Narratives were crafted carefully, repeated often, and reinforced through every available channel. In Germany under Adolf Hitler, these elements came together in a particularly destructive way. War was not seen only as a means of expansion, but as part of a broader effort to redefine society itself. Entire groups of people were labeled, excluded, and ultimately targeted. The state took on the role of deciding who belonged and who did not. This ideology was supported by constant messaging. Posters, films, and speeches presented a unified version of reality, one that justified policies and actions that might otherwise have been questioned. Over time, this environment shaped how millions understood the world around them. As the conflict spread, the boundaries of the battlefield expanded. War was no longer confined to distant front lines. Cities were bombed. Civilian populations were directly affected. The distinction between combat zones and everyday life began to disappear. This was especially evident on the Eastern Front. In 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, an invasion of the Soviet Union on an unprecedented scale. The front stretched across vast distances, involving millions of soldiers and reshaping entire regions. The scope of the conflict was difficult to comprehend. In Stalingrad, the intensity of the war reached a defining moment. The city became a focal point, not only for military strategy, but for endurance itself. Buildings were reduced to ruins. Streets were buried under debris. Fighting took place at close range, often within the remains of homes and factories. Control shifted block by block, sometimes room by room. Winter added another layer of hardship. Temperatures dropped sharply. Supplies became scarce. Conditions made survival increasingly difficult for both sides. For those involved, the experience was defined by persistence. A soldier might measure success not in victory, but in making it through another day. Communication with home grew uncertain and the outcome remained unclear. When the battle finally ended, the losses were immense. German forces suffered a major defeat, marking a turning point in the war. Yet even this was only one part of a much larger story. While armies fought across continents, another tragedy unfolded in parallel. Less visible but equally significant. The Holocaust was a systematic effort to eliminate entire populations. It was organized, deliberate, and carried out over time. Jewish communities along with Romani, individuals with disabilities, political opponents and others were identified and targeted. Many were forced from their homes, transported under harsh conditions and held in confined environments where basic needs were difficult to meet. Families were separated. Personal identities were stripped away. Life was reduced to survival under constant uncertainty. In ghettos, overcrowding and limited resources led to widespread hardship. In camp, systems were established that allowed large numbers of people to be held and in many cases killed. Amid these conditions, individuals tried to hold on to what remained family connections. Memories, small acts of care. A parent comforting a child. A quiet attempt to preserve dignity in circumstances that offered little space for it. Approximately 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust, along with millions of others who were also targeted. It revealed a deeply unsettling reality that modern systems, when directed toward harmful ends, could carry out destruction on a massive scale. War in this sense affected more than physical structures. It challenged the moral framework of entire societies. Even so, there were acts of resistance. In occupied regions, underground networks formed. Individuals took significant risks to protect others, to share information, or to disrupt operations. These efforts were often small in scale but meaningful in their intent. In the Warsaw Ghetto, a group of Jewish fighters organized an uprising despite overwhelming odds. Their actions were not based on the expectation of success, but on a determination to resist. Elsewhere, resistance movements operated in forests, mountains, and cities. They faced difficult conditions, but continued to oppose occupation in whatever ways they could. At the same time, everyday life was being reshaped across the world. With large numbers of men serving in the military, women took on new roles in industry. They worked in factories, contributed to production, and helped sustain wartime economies. These changes would have lasting effects even as societies later adjusted to post-war realities. Children experienced the war in different ways. Education was disrupted. Daily routines changed. In many places, air raid warnings and shelter drills became part of normal life. Cities were deeply affected. In London, sustained bombing campaigns caused widespread damage, though the city continued to function. In Dresden and Tokyo, large-scale attacks led to extensive destruction in short periods of time. As these events unfolded, the distinction between military and civilian spaces became increasingly blurred. By 1945, the war had reached its final phase. The United States introduced a new kind of weapon, one based on nuclear technology. When it was used against Hiroshima, the impact was immediate and far-reaching. A powerful explosion caused extensive destruction across the city. A few days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Shortly after, Japan surrendered, bringing the war to an end. But the introduction of nuclear weapons changed the nature of conflict itself. It demonstrated that a single device could cause widespread destruction, raising new questions about the future of warfare. The end of the war marked both a conclusion and a beginning. The Allied powers had prevailed. Germany had been defeated. Japan had surrendered. Yet the human cost was immense. An estimated 70 to 85 million people had lost their lives. Cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins. Economies were severely damaged. Large numbers of people were displaced, forced to rebuild their lives under difficult circumstances. New global dynamics began to take shape. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as leading powers, but their relationship soon shifted toward rivalry. This tension would define the early stages of the Cold War. Efforts were made to create systems that might prevent future conflicts. The United Nations was established with the goal of encouraging cooperation and dialogue between nations. Still, the impact of the war extended beyond politics and institutions. It affected individuals, families, and communities in lasting ways. Those who survived carried their experiences with them. For many, the memories remained vivid, shaping how they understood the world. These experiences were often passed down, influencing later generations. The consequences were also global. In many regions, especially across Africa and Asia, Movements for independence gained momentum. The war had highlighted contradictions within colonial systems, encouraging demands for self-determination. At the same time, technological development accelerated. Advances in aviation, computing, and medicine reflected the pace of wartime innovation. These developments would influence the decades that followed. Yet progress brought new challenges. Nuclear weapons remained a central concern, representing both a deterrent and a potential threat. In the years after the war, people sought to understand what had happened. Legal efforts such as the Nuremberg trials aimed to hold individuals accountable for actions taken during the conflict. These proceedings helped establish principles that would influence international law. Writers, thinkers, and communities engaged in ongoing discussions about responsibility, ethics, and the nature of human behavior under extreme conditions. The legacy of the war continued to shape global structures and perspectives. It could be seen in alliances in institutions and in the balance of power that defined the post-war era. It also remained present in memory, in the stories that were shared, and in those that were more difficult to express. Within that legacy are difficult truths. That ordinary individuals can become part of systems that cause harm. That institutions can be shaped in ways that allow injustice to take hold. That technological progress does not automatically lead to moral progress. At the same time, there are other lessons. That resistance, even in small forms, can have meaning. That empathy can persist even in difficult circumstances. That individual choices continue to matter. The effects of the Second World War did not end in 1945. They remain visible in the structure of the modern world, in rebuilt cities, in national borders, and in ongoing efforts to remember and understand the past. The conflict continues to influence how societies think about power, conflict, and responsibility. And perhaps the most important question is not only how it happened, but whether similar conditions could emerge again. History does not repeat itself in identical ways. It changes, it adapts, and at times it waits quietly until the world once again believes that such events belong only to the past, until it is reminded otherwise.